Thank you so much for joining me, Ellie. Welcome to Mind Body Solution.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to host you today. This is an exciting time because it's round three for our Mind at Large project, our special series for this channel. And you're a key contributor to this project as well. Just by the way, I wanted to actually make sure that we mention a call for submission. So there's abstract submissions that we'd like people to present to us, and it will be part of our project, part of publication. So a call to action for everyone who wants to be part of this. Submit your submissions before January. I will put a link to that below. So try and join us and hope we see you in Exeter in April. It's going to be from the 15th to the 17th. So yeah, I just thought I'd put
Yes,
that.
and we would particularly appreciate submissions from graduate students and early career researchers. We
Yeah,
want you to be part of this.
definitely. And I will put links to that and all the submission guidelines below. So if you need further details, just click the link below. Eddie, with that being said, this project is there to explore consciousness and its role in reality, from consciousness to cosmos to connection. How do you define mind at large? For you, is it a metaphysical thesis? Is it a methodological stance or something else?
Yes, well, I must admit that my instincts are very cautious when it comes to metaphysics. I'm a bit of a fence sitter, so I don't share necessarily the intuitions or ideas that many of the other people in the group do. What, what I do share with them is the idea. I think that we all share this idea that materialism and physicalism, which is the main game in town, both in science and in philosophy, is a very narrow way of thinking about consciousness. And it doesn't capture the richness of our mental life, but it also doesn't do justice to how consciousness is connected to an organism's being in the world. And I think this is what the Mind at Large is project is trying to capture. We want to we want to get people to start thinking beyond a materialist framework and entertain ideas that maybe that go beyond it. Maybe that it's something more. Maybe that it's something other. Maybe that can't be captured by this framework, which is the working framework for the past 3 centuries or so.
And I think it's important. You just touched on it, but for anyone who's watching and trying to get involved with this, it's great to have someone like you on the podcast with this project as well, because of the very fact that your views are very different from many of the other past guests that I've had. Even so, when it comes to Peter, even though of course you guys share similar views, ultimately it's a great space for people to not just jump on the anti-materialism bandwagon, but rather show diverse opinions and differences within the field of philosophy and show how many of them actually collaborate well together and show the contradictions and the irregularities in other philosophies. So I think it's great that you share a slightly different view. Do you want to perhaps go into some of that? So we've had Peter on the show.
Yes, I mean, it's very important that we are not trying to impose a viewpoint on people, I think. I think our emphasis is on dialogue. We thought, let's bring scientists and philosophers together to start discussing alternatives, because alternatives do exist, of course. It's not that we're just bringing, that we're the first people to bring them up, but it's always on the margins of materialism. I mean, if you think of Rutherford, 125 years ago, he said, 100 years ago, he said, there's physics and there is stamp collecting. That's it. And this is it. This is the idea. And it continues to hold strong, though we do have, there are other views. Increasingly, there's a lot of evidence is accumulating. So we thought, let's bring these people together. Let's think beyond materialism. Maybe there will be some cross-fertilization. And we also, I think, felt, all of us, that in order to start this discussion, because it's going to be three conferences. So we thought that we should start the discussion with how we got here. So we need to talk about the philosophy of science, the sociology of science, the sociology of philosophy, and academia in general. And this is something that is not included in most people's education, and very much so in ours too. And I think Quill Kukla in a paper once said, she wrote that the aim of philosophy, or one of the aims of philosophy, I don't remember exactly, is to denaturalize ideas that seem obvious to us. Because the ideas that everybody shares around us that seem obvious are the ones that go under the radar, the ones that we don't really critically discuss. So I think that what we're trying to do, if I had to sum it up, is that we're trying to denaturalize materialism. And if you understand how we got, the first step is understanding how we got there, because if you understand how we got there, then you will understand that maybe it's not so obvious, it's not so innocent, and it's not neutral, really.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. We've laid out a bit of a framework, Mind at Large project. Now everyone's familiar once again. Let's start and dissect this and go into what we're talking about. When it comes to the philosophy, the history, sorry, of philosophy, of mind particularly, it has been dominated by a materialist view for quite some time. I mean, prior to that, we had dualism, we've had various alternative theories. But when you think of the mind-body problem and you think of consciousness studies, what type of philosophical story would you tell someone? If you were giving us a brief historical lecture right now, how would you condense that into a short summary? It's quite a tough one.
You mean philosophically or scientifically?
Philosophically, more so. So most people start with Descartes, they start with the general dualism. If you were to tell us the story maybe from a mind at large perspective, maybe, let's say to open the doors of thinking beyond the general materialist framework, how would you tell that story?
Well, philosophy, of course, doesn't start with Descartes, but I suppose that the mind-body problem, the problem of consciousness as we have it today, begins with Descartes and really begins, I think it really begins with the beginning of physics as we know it today. But Descartes, of course, was a dualist. And then for many different social forces, some of which you discussed, I think, with Matt and Peter, materialism it's not so much that materialism substituted dualism, is that dualism just became an extremely difficult position to defend for some people, given certain assumptions. And then but there were always other ideas. There was idealism. Idealism is, I think, easier to defend than materialism almost. But then again, for different social forces, because of the leaps that of science, because of the decade of the brain when it comes to consciousness study, to even, I suppose, psychiatry, materialism came to dominate. And this this begins, I think, with Galileo, in the 17th. Well, it doesn't really begin with Galileo, but Galileo, we can identify Galileo as a major force there. Because Galileo comes along and says, look, and this is at the beginning of the scientific revolution, he says, look, I don't know how to handle phenomenal states, conscious states, qualia, whatever you want to call them. So let's put them aside. Let's build science and let's define it as what studies quantifiable phenomena. You know, he says the book of nature is written in mathematical language. So phenomenal qualities are put aside. They're not really out there. They are not part of the physical world. They are part of something inside your head, which is a move which is not really new, of course, in the history of human thinking. I was thinking of Plato today, because Plato had the problem of change. He couldn't understand how change happens. So he says, okay, change is not real. Reality isn't changing, and it's up there. It's up the forms and the ideas. And change is only in the realm of appearances. So this is a similar move to Galileo. So Galileo takes phenomenal states, takes consciousness out of science, and then we build this fantastic science, which is very good at manipulating the world. But of course, if you start asking questions about science, you realize that manipulation is one thing, understanding is quite another. So now so science did all these things. So then science started looking at the brain. And there we had the problem, because we have a lot of information about the brain. We have a lot of information about psychological states and how how human act and react, but we have no idea how to connect those things, which is not surprising since they've been separated at their birth, let's say. And so we have all these other positions. So one way to say is that they don't fit together. They just don't. So we have dualism. Another way is to say they are the same thing. You're just seeing them from a different perspective. That would be some form of materialism, or another kind of monism. Or you can say you don't have to put consciousness back into the physical world, because consciousness was already there all the time, which is forms of panpsychism, I suppose. I'm not sure I answered your question at all.
No, it's great because you sort of giving us a nice map of the arena of mind, let's say, and the way these ideas sort of evolved over time, which is great. And I think,
and now we have 360 theories of consciousness. That's what Robert Lawrence Kuhn said. And he says we 350, 320, I don't know. And he says we are missing one, which is of course true. We are missing one. But my feeling is, and this is more of a feeling than something else, that the answer is not going to come in the framework we currently have. We need a conceptual shift, which I don't think we have right now.
Yeah,
and science, I think, and philosophy have to work together in certain ways, and we can.
Yeah, so yeah, it's true. A paradigm shift is sort of needed for this. I mean, the reason why I was so excited to chat to you is because our work's quite similar. When I did my dissertation, it did work within mental health and psychiatry as well. What do you think our models within psychiatry are lacking? That's just not allowing us to approach consciousness in the way we want to.
Well, it depends which model you are talking about. But well, for instance, a reductive model like the biomedical model of mental disorders, which is not always, it's not always and not necessarily reductive, but let's say it is for the time being. I think it's looking at the wrong place. It's too narrow. You have to look back, because I think you cannot understand consciousness without understanding, or mental disorders without understanding the whole organism in relation to his environment. So if you just look at the brain, I can understand how some people say, but it must be the brain that produces consciousness, and we have to look there. But when it comes to mental disorders, things are much more complicated, I think. And then, of course, if you talk, well, let's take one thing at a time. If we're talking about consciousness, you have to look at the different forms of consciousness. Generally, when we discuss consciousness, when we research consciousness, we are thinking of typical consciousness. And typical consciousness is sober, adult human experience. I mean, there are people who study other kinds of consciousness, but generally that's the default. But there's a huge variation when it comes to mental phenomena. In psychiatry, we see how mental capacities fail and come apart. We see that mental capacities function differently in different beings. We see that consciousness differs from time to time in the same person, depending on what's happening around them, and then you think of psychedelic states. So this is how I got into this, because I'm interested in our obligations to animals, and then I started thinking about animals' minds. This is not my area of research, but I'm very interested in it. And then I was looking in psychedelic therapy, and in both cases, we have consciousness which is atypical. And if you don't look at these kinds of consciousness, and you're looking only at human consciousness, then you can be prone to make, I think, many mistakes. Yeah.
There's also the fact that, I mean, I remember while working as a psychiatric medical officer in psychiatry, there's many psychiatrists who have never heard of things like phenomenological psychopathology. They don't know who Carl Jaspers is. They don't know Merleau-Ponty. They don't know all these other thinkers who have who have given different foundational core features and benefits within psychiatry that have just not been explored enough. Values-based practice and just other alternative ways of looking at people and understanding the nature of reality. We tend to summarize it into the biopsychosocial approach, which, and often people feel very excited about saying that, but it really is very limited still. There's so many more factors beyond that. Is there anything about that you want to touch on?
Well, in psychiatry, you are trained as doctors, really, right? So I suppose that makes sense. Because maybe someone who studies psychology instead of psychiatry would be more educated on these things, no?
Now that's very true. Fair enough. That's a good point. But I still think that when practicing medicine, you still have to take the human experience as a whole. I mean, you can't just get caught up in the biology of the being while ignoring the social, psychological, embodied, inactive, all the other elements that we're trying to explore within this project as well. Because I think it will fundamentally shift the way medicine is practiced as well. Only for the better is what I believe. That might be a personal thing.
Absolutely. I suppose that the problem, the fear is that it becomes very complex. And some people might fear that it therefore becomes intractable. But of course, the other side of the coin is that if it does become very complex, which of course it is very complex, in the case of psychiatry, it gives you more ways to intervene and try and solve the problem instead of like, popping a pill or have 45-minute sessions where you discuss, I don't know, your father.
Yeah, I
No,
think
this is
there's also it's
yes.
multifactorial. There's elements of overworked, underpaid, not enough staff, so many other factors to explore, which does tend to make it a lot more difficult because it's easier to then just give a med, fix the biology, and then thereafter have a momentary fix.
Yes, and of course, I think to be fair to the psychiatrist, I am pretty sure that it's not only because they believe that mental disorders are physical that they give people pills. I think people want pills. I
Yeah.
think it's much easier, first of all, to take a pill than to actually sit down and do the work or change your lifestyle or really go through years of trying to figure things out.
No, I completely agree with that. Anyway, let's move back into this area of consciousness, and then we'll slowly bridge it back into psychiatry. How do you, if when you think of consciousness, do you think of it as something that's fundamental, emergent, constructed, universal? How do you define it?
Fence is the thing. Um, if I were, I'm not quite sure, but I don't know.
That's a good
Yeah,
answer, to be honest.
sometimes I am pulled by the idea that it's something fundamental, but then I don't understand how that can be. I Not that I understand how matter can be fundamental. I have the same problem. I'm pulled by both consciousness and the material world as fundamental. I tend to think if you pushed me a lot, I might think it could be emergent, an emergent property of certain complex structures. At the time, so far, I suppose organic, but I do not exclude the possibility that
Would and
other
within that emergence, would you say then it would be more organic within the brain, or would it be something else? So, electromagnetic information, let's say like semi-field theory. You've got someone like John Joe McFadden. You've got other people who explore beyond the brain, but still very much part of the brain.
how do you draw that distinction? Where
So
do you draw the line?
yeah, it's a tough one. So with what some of the so that comes into more for I wouldn't say it's quantum mechanics, but someone like John Joe McFadden would talk about semi-field theory, consciousness as in electromagnetic information field. So it's not necessarily the actual brain's software, but rather the emitting outer activity of the actual software. So there's an extra layer, let's say, within the material world, though. Let's not forget that's still a very much materialist theory. However, it's not actually just the brain. I might be butchering that theory, by the way.
Um, um, uh,
Does that at least sound plausible?
Look, it sounds more plausible than saying that it's a property of the brain. I cannot see how that could be. Yes, I mean, first of all, why would the brain be conscious? A brain, right? An organism needs to be conscious. And the organism needs to be conscious, I think, in order to interact with the world it found itself into. So, yes, the idea that other things in the body have a sane consciousness, I think this is absolutely right. But I can't evaluate the theory because it's this thing that there's something missing that will allow us to make sense of all these theories. Because many theories have many parts that make sense, and there are many theories that seem plausible. But for something to be plausible and for something to be true is very different. And I think we think about materialism. We don't even know what matter is. And I'm not thinking in terms of intrinsic nature. I think that looking for an intrinsic nature might be the wrong way to go. And I also think that maybe matter could be just its effects. I realize this is very controversial thing to say. Maybe there's nothing more to matter than that. But even that doesn't solve our problems. I mean, how does matter? What does it mean for something to have charge other than how it interacts? We don't understand the relationships of things, the relations of physical forces, let's say. So before we can make sense of all these theories, I would need a better understanding of the concepts involved.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us to get that information and to try and gather as much as possible because as we just touched on briefly, it fundamentally changes the way we will treat people, patients, humanity, and the way we move forward. So there's so many implications to theories of consciousness that it's a very important thing to discuss.
Yes. And also how we deal with each other every day, I think
Yeah.
that's also very important. Yes.
Much of your work intersects with psychiatry, as we just said. Let's say within the brain model of the way we sort of understand organisms, we tend to think, okay, there's something going wrong in the prefrontal cortex. This is the type of medication I want to give. This is what I want you to do. Let's change that ontology. Let's say that there's something deeper here, something much more interconnected, more complex. Like we said earlier, you can't just give it a quick fix pull. How should we then change our metaphysics of mind to adapt and accommodate this changed ontology?
I wouldn't start with ontology and then going to what we um, understand of mental disorders. I think we should go the other way around. Um, so first of all, what seems to be the case, right? When you read about mental disorders in the popular press, they say, I don't know, anxiety is a chemical imbalance, and addiction is just a disease. It's nothing more, and so on. Now, I think let me start by that, and then I think I will get to your question sideways. I think this is wrong because, first of all, a mental disorder, we have a case of a mental disorder when a person systematically interacts with the world in a problematic way. Now, what is problematic about that? What's problematic about that, and I'm following here Matthew Broom and Lisa Bortolotti, is that the behavior, the interaction violates certain norms. Now, these could be epistemic norms. So let's say norms of rationality, that you form beliefs based on not enough evidence, moral norms, you go around killing people or hurting people, or social norms. I don't know, you rarely wash, you go to the theater and shout things at the people who are performing plays. So if you think about it, that's how we identify mental disorders, and that's how we try to solve them. I mean, if I gave you a brain and I said, look, if I gave you a brain scan and I said, look, so and so is happening, schizophrenia, but there is absolutely nothing in the behavior of the person that's changed, in the experience of the person that's changed. Suppose he's absolutely normal in the statistical sense of normal. Would you say that the person has schizophrenia, suffering from schizophrenia? No, that's not the level we identify that. So of course people say yes, but there's something there in the brain. Undoubtedly, things happen in the brain. Things happen in the brain as we speak. Things happen. The brain changes every time you learn something new. There will be changes in the brain when a person is suffering from anxiety, has OCD, schizophrenia, whatever you want. But that's not the level at which the pathology lies. Because in fact, just a variation, even a variation shared by many people, doesn't necessarily amount to pathology. So let's take this as a first given, that this is not the level at which the pathology is identified. Let's take the question of evidence, which is also important, that we really don't have any clinically useful biomarkers for mental disorders. Okay, we have some biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease, but I'm not sure that that counts as psychiatric disorder. And we have a fully penetrant and dominant gene for Huntington's disease. But again, I'm not sure that those count as psychiatric disorders, because the primary effect of these conditions is not mental. The mental is secondary. The mental effect is secondary. The primary effect is physical. Yeah. And we also see that for some reason, which who knows why, therapy works. Therapy works to some extent in some disorders. Sometimes it works along with other things, with medication. But therapy seems to work. And when I say to work, I mean to help people, because that's, as doctors, psychiatrists, want to understand certain things, but they also want to help people. And it would be useless if we didn't help people. In metaphysical terms, this is a suggestion for something called mental causation or downward causation, right? It goes from the mental to the physical. This is something which, of course, physicalists would not accept. Now let's go to metaphysics. As we have materialism in the philosophy of mind and physicalism in the philosophy of mind, we have substance metaphysics. Now, substance metaphysics, well, the idea of a substance is a very difficult idea to pin down, and many people have very different ideas. But when we talk, the idea in substance metaphysics is that the world is made up of substances. And the basic, what is a substance? A substance is an entity that has a natural unity, whose properties that persist through changes in its properties, and is to some extent independent of other things. So the concept of independent, unity, stability, and endurance are basic. So Aristotle would say that an organism is a substance. Descartes would say that we have the mental substance and the physical substance. The physical substance is extended, and the mental substance is that thinks. And this is the metaphysical substratum that has dominated Western thinking. We start with Aristotle's essentialism. Then in the 17th century, we have atomism. And then we gradually move towards a constant attempt to reduce things to their constituent parts and relation. And substance metaphysics, the basis of substance metaphysics is stasis, the lack of change in systems. Remember Plato couldn't explain change? Okay. It comes full circus. Now, there's an alternative to substance metaphysics, and that is process metaphysics. So process metaphysics offers a completely different way of understanding the world. So the world up is not made of substances. It's not made of things. It's made of processes, intertwining processes that exist at different timescale. And of course, you'll say, but what do you mean? I see things, I see objects, I see flowers and mountains and desks. And so a process metaphysics would say, yes, of course, but the stability you experience in the world is the result of processes in dynamic interaction. And some processes work in a very large time scale, and some processes work in a very short time scale. So a mountain is a process stabilized at a very high time scale, a human organism, a relatively high scale, as opposed to cell renewal in our bodies or the life cycle of a bat, shorter time frames. Now, if you see, why am I saying all this? If you see the world as being made up of processes, there are certain things that become more difficult to sustain. Now, a substance metaphysic doesn't necessarily lead to materialism, doesn't necessarily lead to physicalism or reductionism. No, it doesn't entail them. But it's easy to get into that kind of mode of thought. When you think in terms of processes, there are certain things that do not come so natural. So one of the things that doesn't come naturally is reductionism. Another thing that doesn't come naturally is essentialism. And this relates to our question of mental disorders. Because a process, think of a river, it's like water flowing in a river. Processes don't have hard boundaries. They flow into each other, they intertwine, one sustains the other. You know, the heart is sustained by the parts, but the heart also within an organism sustain the parts that make it up. So we don't really have a hierarchical level of reality. The world is not made up in neat levels. And this is something that we see constantly in human thinking. People like boxes because we can manage boxes. But when we let go of our assumptions and we look at the world, boxes are rarely there. So if you don't have levels, the idea in physicalism and materialism in many ways is that there are levels of reality, and the higher levels are determined completely by the lower levels. If you don't have these levels, then the reductionist way of thinking becomes very difficult to sustain. There are no higher levels, higher and lower levels. It's all interconnected. And the other thing with process metaphysics is that it allows for different kinds of causation. It's not only from the bottom up. It's not only from the small to the big. It allows for downward causation, mental causation, mereological, organizational causation. Because you start thinking the world as a place of middle-sized stable objects, and you start seeing a world made up of processes which are in dynamic and continuous interaction, and causation becomes multi-directional.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful.
Sorry.
That's beautifully put. And I think it's what I find very fascinating is how when you see things from that lens, a lot of people tend to think of that, even process philosophy. I see a lot of scientists when they talk about it, seeing it as unscientific. But if you think about it, it's a lot more. It takes reductionism to another level in a sense, because you've reduced everything now. So even those categories that you've labeled, you've actually taken it further to actually break those down into more processes and even more details. So it's actually even more of a great scientific tool in that sense.
Yes, I mean, I don't think reductionism is itself bad in itself.
Yeah, yes.
And I don't think that reductive explanations should disappear, even in the original sense of going to the bottom. I just think these shouldn't exhaust all explanations, and it
Yeah,
shouldn't
it's
exhaust.
still a great tool and it helps us to picture things and imagine what's going on. But ultimately, it's still something you need to think about that there's something beyond this that's still occurring. And it's a process we've yet to understand perhaps. But the reason why I asked that first question was to actually get to this next one, which was, is the concept of a disorder itself a metaphysical commitment, something about how the world actually is, or is it essentially normative, no matter what?
Oh, uh,
Bringing out the tough ones today. Sorry. It's just I'm super excited to talk to someone who's worked in the same in the same arena.
yes, because but you're asking a person who very rarely has huge difficulty committing to an answer with certainty.
Look, I think that's still a great way to approach the world because it shows how much you're putting thought into every answer and that you're not solely fixated on a conclusion because you're open to actually exploring these ideas. So I think that's great.
Yes, but I still have to give an answer.
Yeah, that's true.
Uh, so the question is whether it's something completely normative or whether uh,
Whether a disorder is itself a metaphysical commitment, or whether it's essentially normative.
um, look, it depends on. I think this goes back to the question of what is fundamental in the world. If matter is fundamental, indeed, I would say that then it's more of a normative commitment. But if there are other kind of fundamental entities, or whatever you want to call them, they're not really entities, yes, um, then I'm not sure that it would be purely normative. It's a way of not answering the question. But it depends what the metaphysical structure of the world is. And I'm not sure what the metaphysical structure of the world is.
Well, at the moment, when we look at cognitive sciences, there's a growing emphasis on things like predictive processing. You've got models, mind as a model becoming quite a big hypothesis that everyone's working with. How compatible is this view with your own philosophical view of consciousness?
I think the predictive processing does get uh, close. It seems to get things close enough. Because first of all, it moves away from the idea that consciousness is a window to the world. And I think that's um, probably wrong. As you see, everything is probably or possibly or yes. Um, but the model in predictive processing is a best guess model. So it's a model that is constantly being updated based on sensory input. So if you have a glitch, you fix it. Now, I think it still remains too internalist for me. It's still too much in the brain. I think, like most theories, I think there are some good intuitions, and then when you try to formulate the theory itself, you lose part of the plausibility. But you're still trying to pin down what I think consciousness is,
Yeah.
and
That's, look, I mean, ultimately, that's always at the forefront of
um,
any conversation on the show. That's always at the forefront. We'll try to get it out of you before the end of the episode.
yes,
We'll get.
I,
I think
I would say,
I'll get somewhere towards the end. We'll you just have to keep fishing, and then
um,
hopefully you get a catch at some point. Given your interests, Ellie, in metaphilosophy,
yeah.
what is philosophy actually doing when it studies consciousness? Would you say it's discovering truths, building conceptual models, critiquing science, or something more existential, perhaps?
I think a bit of everything, a bit of all of the above. Um, uh, Philosophers who study consciousness, of course, try to understand the phenomenon. Usually, they try to understand it as a natural phenomenon, not necessarily, not always, but yes. And part of and I think you can do philosophy at least on certain subjects without being informed about science and in discussion with what science says. And when a philosopher does that, invariably, I think, they will criticize the conceptual foundations of science. So I think the work is very much conceptual, but here we are opening the question of what the relation between science and philosophy is, which I can talk about. But yeah.
I think, yeah, go into it if you'd like.
Okay, because I think this is something that's very often passed over very superficially. But it's important to get certain things right. So, okay, so science and philosophy have the same aim, and the aim is, of course, to understand the world and ourselves. And I suppose we should also say that the word science comes from the word, I don't know if I'm saying this correctly, in the Latin word scientia, which means knowledge, and the Latin verb scire, which is to know. So Collingwood gives a good definition. He says, look, when we talk about science, what we are talking about is a body of orderly or systematic thinking about a specific subject matter. And this is the way we would, the meaning of science that we use when we say philosophy is a science, or mathematics is a science, or history is a science. It's a bit of an honorific term. So because in this sense, any discipline that we pursue rigorously and with certain methodological standards is science. But then when we contrast philosophy with science, and when we ask what the relationship is, that's not the kind of science we're talking about. We are talking about something much narrower. We're talking about the empirical sciences. So, and it's Collingwood interestingly says that this is a slang use of the word science. So it's a set of disciplines that follows a certain method to uncover truth about the world. Now, so the general aim is the same, but science aims more wants to construct a body of facts about the world, whereas philosophy aims at conceptual clarity. Think about in how many different ways we talk about consciousness and a more general understanding of things. And Sellers says that I think this is the best attempt to explain what philosophy is. That the aim of philosophy is to understand how things, in the broadest possible sense of the word, hang together in the broadest possible sense of the word. So science would study quarks and muons and gluons and chemical elements and cells, let's say. But philosophy will ask, okay, what's the relation between muons and gluons with stamp collecting, or paying a bill, or our obligations to animals, and so on. So philosophy is much more general, asks much more fundamental questions, and these do not fall within the purview of science. And there's also seems to be a lot of disagreement among philosophers, which is not the same in science, even though there's a lot more disagreement in science than people tend to believe. So anyway, so when we talk about what the relationship between science and philosophy is, I think there are three questions we have to distinguish. So one is, would there be science without philosophy, as we know it today? And I think the answer to that is no, but that's a contingent historical fact, because science appears in the 16th century when people start to reject Platonism and Aristotelianism and theology as ways of knowing about the world. And then during the Enlightenment, philosophers and scientists were very much in dialogue. Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, people like that, Locke, contributed to this new body of knowledge and offered metaphysical foundations and a framework for it. And then after the 17th century, we start, with Galileo, who's come along. He has his mathematical approach. We have the experimental method. And slowly, these two, science and metaphysics, start to separate. But this happens very slowly. And it's important to remember that until the beginning of the 20th century, it was common in England for physicists to call themselves natural philosophers. And Max Born's position at Edinburgh was Tate Professor of Natural Philosophy. So I think historically science wouldn't exist without philosophy. But again, this is a historical contingency, I suppose. Now, the other question, the intermediate question is the practice of science distinct from the practice of philosophy? And I think the answer then is absolutely yes. People don't like to hear it, but yes. I mean, there are scientists who are philosophically inclined. There are philosophers who study philosophy, and who discuss philosophical issues, like Seth Lloyd at MIT or Robert Speckens at the Perimeter Institute of Theoretical Physics in Canada. And of course, Einstein read a lot of philosophy. Max Born, inaugural lecture in 1938 was called Some Philosophical Problems, I think, in Modern Physics. And Schrödinger, who's my favorite, who actually says in 1956 in What is Life, he says explicitly, the origins of modern science lie in Western philosophy. And if you don't understand Western philosophy, you won't understand modern science. And he also says something which I find amazing. He says no scientist that I know would say this. He says features of today's scientific image are historically produced and not logically necessitated. So there are scientists who understand philosophy, who tackle philosophical questions, but generally most scientists don't. And often most of them, or those who do it badly. Very good scientists, very bad philosophers. Fact. I mean, they don't even often know what they talk about. But then the modern question, and I think here is where the real question lies, is can there be science without philosophical thinking in its practice? And I think that though academic philosophy and, the details of what we do are not necessary, but the general kind of thinking, which is philosophical, needs to be part of science. And here Dennett also says that there's no science without philosophy. There's only science that carries its philosophical baggage without examination. And Kuhn also says that during paradigm shifts, scientists turn to philosophers to unpuzzle, to solve the puzzles. Why? Because you are looking at the assumptions you're making to weaken the hold of tradition on the mind. So it's always the scientists who are at the frontiers of science, I think, who are more philosophically inclined and better at philosophy. So one of the things that I think philosophers studying science consciousness do is looking for these assumptions. This is the critical work, the conceptual work that I think is necessary in our discussion, especially in a field that's so muddy as consciousness. I mean, we don't know what consciousness is. We can't agree on that. We don't know who's conscious, or what kinds of being could be conscious. We don't know. We don't agree on how we should study consciousness. So some philosophical work needs to be done. So ultimately, to wrap this up, I think that when you ask what is the relation between science and philosophy, you already have assumptions built into this question. And one of the assumptions is that you have a view of science that is sort of artificial, that science deals only, it's someone in a lab with his hands in the mud who tries to express theories in functional language, not interested in parsimony, not interested in unification of theories, not interested in the symmetry and things like that. And that's true of many scientists, but not all. And there are parts of science and philosophy that you cannot tell apart. I think there's a continuity to science and philosophy, like there's a continuity with math and physics. Most science is science and most philosophy is clearly philosophy. But there are parts of both where you can't really make a distinction between the two, except in pragmatic terms. There's a pragmatic distinction and the marginal connections. Yes, so I think ultimately we have to, the disciplines have to inform each other. And I think that I suspect that that's the only way that we will manage to make the leap and understand something more metaphysical about consciousness. There's something missing here.
Yeah, in keeping with what you're talking about now, and something you said earlier regarding the naturalization of philosophy of mind, should philosophy of mind be naturalized, fully integrated with sciences, or does that risk losing the phenomena we're trying to understand in the first place?
Well, it depends what you mean by naturalism.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, what do you mean? There's a sense in which naturalism means that I don't believe in anything supernatural, God forbid, right? But that's a whole question. What does supernatural mean? So I can break this down for you too, and we can try and figure this out together.
I think let's do it.
Okay, so at least in philosophy, there are two ways of understanding naturalism. One is as a methodological recommendation, like an epistemological approach. So you say that genuine knowledge can only come from the sciences. That's it. That's the only path to truth, or to knowledge anyway. And again, here we can quote Sellers. He says, in the dimension of describing the world, science is the measure of all things, of everything that, of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not. A sweeping statement, and which I find quite silly, but anyway, I didn't say that. So one is that science is our only tool for uncovering truth. And then we have a metaphysical or ontological claim. So you're a naturalist if you think that the natural is all that exists. And then, of course, you can define naturalism in many different ways. So John Searle is a biological naturalist. David Papineau and David Armstrong, sorry, are more of physicalists. But the idea here is that when we talk about naturalism, usually we go from, so naturalism is associated with scientific understanding. Scientific understanding is associated with reduction. So try to figure out what it's made of, how the parts interact. Reductionism is associated with physicalism and materialism. And so naturalism is reductionism. So to answer your question, if you think, if that's what you mean, no. The answer is no. I don't think it's necessary. And I'm not the only person who thinks, of course, this. But I don't think naturalism requires reductionism or physicalism. I think that what we want, I mean, we should reject things that don't exist, clearly. And what exists is the real. And to say that that is exhausted by what science says there is, makes anything not tackled by science supernatural, which I think is quite an extraordinary statement. I mean, even the statement itself, all there is what science says there is. It's sort of a metaphysical statement. It's not. It's not a piece of scientific knowledge. Okay, so it's a regulative principle, let's say. And I think the real question to ask here is there a good reason to think that we do not understand something if we have not understood it in a non-mental way? So if we only understand it in a mental way. And I think, no, I don't think that we have been given good enough reasons for that. If we had answers to the questions about consciousness, and if science could provide them, maybe the answer would be slightly different. But now we have these hand-thumping, what do you call them? Materialists. I say it must be this way, but there really is no tangible evidence. So I think that philosophers should listen to scientists, but they should not necessarily agree with them. They should take things into consideration. And in C.D. Broad, in his book, The Mind and Its Place in Nature, C.D. Broad was a British emergentist. He has a beautiful line. He says, we tend to confuse the author of nature with the editor of nature. That's 25 years ago. So we shouldn't um, confuse the map with the territory. The map, science can be a map, but let's not think that this is identical with what we're trying to figure out.
Well, your work in bioethics often deals with moral status of animals and extends into things like AI. Do non-human minds challenge our assumptions about consciousness more than AI does?
I don't think AI currently challenges our ideas of consciousness.
I think
Currently,
let's go into why. I think it would be good.
yes.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think they're conscious. LLMs, for instance, are conscious. They might be one. No. I don't think LLMs will be conscious. But I don't exclude the possibility that non there can be creatures, non-organic creatures that could be conscious. I surprisingly, I don't think that that's an impossibility. It's not the way they are now. I don't think there's any discussion there. They might be intelligent right now, in certain ways, but yeah, um, I don't exclude it. Of course, it wouldn't be just something behind the screen. As I said before, I don't think that an isolated brain needs to be conscious. If we made complex enough machines that interact with the world, I think eventually it could happen. I've seen Stranger Things, um, but well, I think that animals. Well, the one thing that I think animals show us is that consciousness can come in many different forms, and I think this is very important to remember. And I think this is what psychedelics also do, that we have this idea of what consciousness is, but consciousness arises when many different things come together. And it's not just an on-off. It's not like, I don't think consciousness never existed and all of a sudden humans appeared and there was light. I think consciousness and cognition is an ongoing process of sense making in your interaction with the world. And I think you see, it emerges from the complex interaction of a brain, senses, the evolutionary path of an organism, and the kind of life they have evolved to live. Yes. So, I mean, first of all, the senses. A species will have experiences that come through the senses it uses most in its interaction with the world, and that, of course, will specify the kind of information the brain tends to prioritize. So some birds have very rich visual worlds, or dogs have a very detailed olfactory world. That must have an effect in their phenomenology, how they experience the world. Then there's the brain structure. We have a very layered neocortex. So we have the ability to be flexible in our thinking. You'd be surprised to learn that we have a wide range of emotions. We can plan ahead. Birds, on the other hand, some birds have a very different brain structure, but they have a very complex pallium. So again, they have some birds exhibit problem-solving abilities, tool use. But the brain structure you have and the senses you have also affect what you experience as affordances in the world, right? How you can use the world. And then, of course, we have animals and humans, animals, different kinds of animals, including humans, have very different cognitive capacities. So I think that all of these things change how you experience the world. And I think that phenomenology comes into consciousness. And I think if you start observing animals and if you start taking animals seriously and you start not thinking that only we are conscious and they are not, but if you start thinking, okay, they're conscious, what is their consciousness like? You open up your thinking about consciousness in ways that is essential, in the same way that psychedelics do the same. And for AI, of course, we always have to distinguish intelligence from consciousness. Sometimes you have consciousness without intelligence somehow. Sometimes you can have intelligence without consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it takes us back to the infamous, what is it like to be a bat? So it's one of these fundamental questions. I mean, given your experience in cognitive science, psychiatry, do you think that generally consciousness research needs to incorporate subjective reports more seriously?
Yes.
Yeah. And that
Yes.
we rely too heavily on third-person data?
Yes, absolutely.
And then how can we use that information to then approach other species, knowing that we lack this inherent ability to understand their subjective reports?
Uh, that's a very good question, and I was thinking about it this morning. Um, I don't know. That's ethologists seem, and other scientists that deal with animals seem to have methods of understanding animals in ways that I don't even. I should get into this research and understand how they do it. But how do they know, for instance, that bees have the ability to solve basic mathematical problems? How do you figure that out? I don't know. This is beyond me. But thankfully, there are people who know much more about that than me.
Yeah, I think that would be it's really exciting. I think it was about 2 days ago I saw something about it might have been orcas or dolphins, but like every few months you're noticing new breakthroughs in the way they communicate, and we're figuring these things out, and some of the tools and the method, the ways that they do this, it's incredible. Like when you see what some scientists are capable of doing when they put their heart and soul into something and they're really passionate about a project, then you see true creativity come out. And it's particularly, I find, in those types of experiments with animals where that passion brings out a creativity that's like nothing I've ever seen before.
That is true. That is true. Yeah, you're right.
I forgot to ask you this earlier, but how do you distinguish between consciousness, selfhood, and agency?
um, Consciousness, self agency. I'm not quite sure about agency. And I'm not quite sure about consciousness. I was because again I had this discussion the other day. I said um, when I think of consciousness, I there are parts of it that the way I think about it uh, goes close to the global workspace theory. That so consciousness is this phenomenal world that is these experiences we have that we are all very intimately connected to. We all know what we're talking about when we say that I have certain emotions, certain fears, um, certain sensations, and so on. So it's that where that but I think access, you also need to incorporate access consciousness to that. So you also need to incorporate the idea that these things are available to you to introspection, and that and I know that there are limits to this train of thought, and that you can also use them introspectively to develop more feelings, more beliefs, more whatever it is you're talking about. The sense of self also requires a delimitation between you and the other person. I think there are, and I think consciousness and the self in humans, at least, a sense of self, usually go hand in hand, except in certain pathological conditions. But then the question is, if they are if they always go together, what do we do with animals? Do we want to say that animals have a sense of self? And to that I would say that of course I can't exclude it. I don't know how to give you necessary and sufficient conditions for each one of these things. I don't think agency necessarily comes with consciousness or a sense of self, but consciousness and selfhood I think are intimately connected, yet not in ways that cannot come apart.
Well, that's precisely why we've got the Mind at Large project happening. Is that's where hopefully we get more answers about all these questions from you, all the other great panelists. When you think about the Mind at Large project,
I suspect we'll have more questions than answers, by the way.
probably, most likely, I think that's probably the goal as well. So just to
Yeah.
open up this platform, try and bring together all these different metaphysical frameworks. Do you see convergence on the horizon, or are these views all ultimately just unbridgeable?
You mean theories of consciousness?
All these different metaphysical frameworks. Do you see a convergence on the horizon?
No, I don't. Yes, as I said, I think that when and it's very difficult for me to talk about it because it's not my thought is not very specific on this. I have a sense that in order to solve this puzzle, something is missing, and I don't. And once that is, I think the field of play will change completely, and I think we're going to look back at today the way we were looking at, I don't know, we thought that ancient Greeks thought about the physical world.
Almost like an ancient past, like the Ian Vattel almost, the way we perceive that today.
Exactly, yes. I think I even have difficulty expressing it because I don't know what it's going to be. And I do, to return, because I talked about emergence before. So one thing that pulls me is the idea that, it's consciousness is an emergent feature of the world. I don't have a problem with emergentism, even strong emergentism. I know people react to it a lot, but I don't. I think the problems that are identified with it are not problems that are not shared by other theories. But I also have a strong pull towards the fundamentality that you asked me before. Um, I, I, I don't think consciousness and matter are two different fundamental things. I think they are somehow the same. And I know that people have said this before. But none of the explanations given for this make sense. I mean, there's something we're missing. And it might, people will hate me for saying this, my colleagues, but it might be a scientific breakthrough.
Yeah. Do you think that fundamentality is actually almost a teleological purpose for consciousness in a sense? Or like this, is this phenomenon a process that we're trying to get to in a sense, or not really?
Not really.
Okay.
I mean, I don't, yeah. I don't think in that way. No, I
Well, I
don't.
think it's even better that you're saying this because it highlights the diversity of thought that we're going to have at this conference. And that's exactly the point. So I think it's perfect that you are saying that because at some point when I ask Peter, Andrew, anyone else, Matt, about this, it's going to be good to actually have these discussions. And I'm chatting to John and Jared soon. So we're going to be having a nice group chat together.
You will be. Okay, I was going to ask you. Okay.
So it's going to be exciting. I think that this project has so much potential to be something so great. And I'm super excited to be there. Looking ahead, if you look at the Mind at Large project, what do you foresee in the next 3 years? So I know you're looking for that breakthrough that we need to make, but what do you see?
Yes, I don't expect it to happen at the Mind at Large conferences. I
Along
think
the
we're going to
line.
have a lot of fun and interesting ideas and become more wise, but I don't think we'll get the answer. But anyway, so the question was
But
what?
in general, your thoughts on the Mind at Large project, what excites you most about this? What are you most looking forward to? And looking ahead, what can the viewers expect from this?
Well, for me personally, because as I said, I think I am the most conservative of the bunch in many ways. Um, and what has attracted me to this is first my curiosity for thinking that is so different from mine. and I look forward to being challenged. I want people to challenge my assumptions because you kind of stick with those. And I'm really looking forward to it because I mean, generally the easiest thing to do when somebody disagrees is dismiss them as not understanding or, he's stupid. Um, but then if you put yourself among people who are smart people, who are educated people, who know what they're talking about, it's not, a conversation over beer, then you really have to take things seriously. So you really have to think, how can somebody think that? So I want to see, for me, that's very important. And maybe there'll be something there for me to learn. What I hope will happen generally is I think that even though the default view of people is very materialistic, and I see it in my students, you ask them and immediately they say, it's all it's all matter. Uh, but they don't really believe that because when we try and break it down, they don't want to say soul. They stay away from the word soul, but then they talk about something spiritual up there. So I think people um, do have this need. And I don't mean just a psychological need. I think there's something there that they're not really convinced about it. So I think what I hope this project will do is allow people to have these thoughts and allow people to entertain them. And then if you allow these things, if you allow space for these things, then one day new hypotheses might come. My student, who are rarely are philosophy majors, uh, when he's in a lab, will allow himself to entertain an idea without thinking, oh, this is silly. Because there's a lot of gatekeeping in science and in philosophy.
You just touched on something very important because I often talk about this, the fact that, I mean, we think that materialism or this monist view of reality is what most people tend to believe. But when you do the studies, I think it's almost clear that most people actually have a very much dualistic view on reality.
Yeah.
And what you're touching on about that soul part is pretty much that essence that they think is there, this ethereal, immaterial entity that does exist. So for the most part, we're trying to actually, it's going to probably be both trying to convert more dualists then. than
Well,
mon-
yes, because I think there's a difference because okay, people don't think about metaphysics, so they don't have necessarily very coherent views about things. But if you ask them about the soul, uh, uh, many people will say, yes, of course, the soul exists. Well, how could it not? But if you ask them whether the mind is different from the brain, there they say no. And that's something about the state that has to do with the status of science in our society. Um,
So it's like
yes.
one's more of a rational thought and the other one's more of an intuitive feel of reality when it comes to the soul thought. Um,
Yes, because I mean, nobody, you hear scientists talk about, not scientists, science reporting, I suppose, dismissing the idea of a mind or talking about everything is matter, but you don't have the same discussions about the soul because people don't really discuss the soul very much in those contexts. But I would like, and this is very strange coming from me. If my students listen, hear this, they'll say, "How could you say this?" Because I'm one of those people who are very, as I said, cautious about this. But I think that one of the good things is that allow people to think this, and allow people to pursue this philosophically. Allow them to, because of course you're a scientist, you're a philosopher. You can't. There's this idea that a scientist or a philosopher studies whatever they want. No, of course they don't. It's a job. You need funding. You need to publish. So you're going to go with the safe questions, the ones that are going to give you the promotion, you're going to give you funding, right? And I think this might be very good for people's careers, but it's very bad for science and philosophy. It's what we don't know that
that,
keeps us
that that
going.
is a very good point, and I think that's something worth highlighting. The fact that because this is such an academic pursuit, and what we're doing here is actually so it's going to be so grounded in academia as well that it's a great opportunity for lots of people. I mean, as we spoke about earlier, the abstract submissions. This is a great way to expose ideas and to explore this in a much more open-minded way. not falling
Yes.
trap into this relativism where you can just talk about anything. Obviously, we still want rigorous
No,
philosophical.
we don't know that we definitely not everything goes. We still remain academics, we still remain philosophers, and you know that we are the most strict reviewers of all. But we won't judge the subject matter. We're going to look at the evidence, the argumentation. Yeah, so if you have an idea that's out there, but you can support it adequately, try us.
The overall goal, I think it's beautiful. I think your work's wonderful. It's exciting to chat to you, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you present or what you show us when we get there. But yeah, in general, Mind at Large project. What are you most excited about, Elly?
I'm excited about being challenged.
Yeah.
I love it when, like you know, when people ask me questions or bring up an idea, and I think that can't be possibly be true, and then they give me reasons, and I say, okay, which is
So let's see what happens. I'm also looking forward to it. Hopefully, our minds both change, and yeah, I can't
oh
wait.
yes,
Yeah,
we'll
I
either
can't
have
wait.
no ideas or get out of them very confused. But either way, I think being intellectually shaked is good, and I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, and I think this is the start of a 3-year odyssey that's hopefully going to continue for as long as possible. So, Elly, thank you so much for joining me. It's been such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much,
And
and see you soon.